doing nothing. The day following our unsuccessful attempt to climb Rataban was brilliantly fine. I did nothing, not because I was tired, but because I was lazy. By nature, I am a lazy person, but unhappily, I seldom have the opportunity of being lazy, in which I do not differ from any other father of a family who has to earn his living. And now there were heaven sent opportunities. Why had I sweated up to the call on Rataban when I might have been lazy? I could see its serene and shining curve against the deep blue sky, distant and remote, above the silver birches. In that answer lay the answer to why do you climb? Mountaineering madness, no doubt, but assuming that this madness is impossible to eradicate, how is mountaineering to be enjoyed best? Amid a welter of conflicting philosophies, I have always clung to one idea that to get a kick out of life, a man must sample the contrast of life. And so it is with mountaineering. The positive ceases to exist when there is no negative. Activity can only be measured against inactivity. Therefore, to appreciate the joys of activity, it is necessary to practice passivity. Hence, the day off. Now, and day off day is not something to be indulged in grudgingly. It is a necessary and integral part of mountaineering, the essential complement of the on day. I can sympathize with the man who, with only a short holiday, scales all the peaks he can in the time. Yet, if he neglects inactivity, he neglects contemplation, and we cannot appreciate nature otherwise. There are many who climb and enjoy climbing for exercise, fresh air, good health, and relaxation from a sedentary life. Yet nature is discernible, in part only through the medium of physical exercise. A superman may be able to divorce his spiritual consciousness from his physical makeup at all times, but there are few supermen, and most of us must strive physically and mentally to discern the verities of creation. The West assumes its superiority over the East primarily because it is further advanced in mechanical matters. But woe betide, it continued to associate mechanisms with spiritual progress. In Garhwal, I met a true civilization, for I found contentment and happiness. I saw a life that is not enslaved by the time factor but is not obsessed by the idea that happiness is dependent on money and materials. I had never before realized until I camped in the Valley of Flowers how much happiness there is in simple living and simple things. By standards of the West, I led a life of discomfort, and I frankly admit that I should not be content to lead such a life in England, for it is necessary to conform to the standards of one's environment. A large majority of people do not realize how necessary it is to conform to these standards, and for this reason look aghast on the discomforts endured by explorers. Genuine discomforts of fatigue, heat, and cold are common enough in mountaineering and exploration, but the largest part of so called discomfort is not discomfort at all, except when measured against a different standard and a different environment. To my mind, the acme of mental and spiritual discomfort would be to live in some super luxury hotel in the Valley of Flowers. Happiness is best achieved by adapting ourselves to the standards of our environment. For this reason, I suspect that cranks and extremists are essentially unhappy persons and symptomatic of a life that has become socially and mechanically too complex for its environment. In Garhwal, I found no red, green, or black shirts, no flags and emblems, no mechanisms, no motor cars or aeroplanes. But I did find a happy and contented people. I think the attitude of Himalayan people to Western progress is best summed up in the words of a Tibetan. And Tibetan consider themselves superior to Europeans in spiritual culture. He said, "We do not want your civilization in Tibet, for wherever it is established, it brings unhappiness and war. It is a terrible indictment, and it is true." During the morning, I lounged about the camp. It was a morning like other mornings, quiet and seeming scarcely to breathe. Dew lay thick on the flowers, birds sang in the forest, and the air was sweet and charged with pleasant smells. I reclined on the bank below the camp. Presently, a gentle breeze began to blow, touching the flowers with light fingers. Smaller flowers, such as the blue corydales, quivered a little, but the taller flowers, the white anemones and the golden nomocaris, nodded in slow undulations as though conscious of their grace and dignity. During the afternoon, clouds gathered, building up slowly, columns by column and mass by mass. There was a wild sunset with fingers and lurid light, but as usual, evening established equilibrium in the atmosphere, and stars shone out in their thousands as night spread from behind and snows of Rataban. We were very content. I knew the men were content because they used often to sing their simple Tibetan melodies. This is one, a great favorite with Wang Di when he was climbing a hillside, as well as I can remember it. In immeasurable contentment, I sat by the fire. The snow peak. During our attempt to climb Rataban, I had been much impressed by the beautifully proportioned snow peak to the south of Bhayandar Valley and had decided to attempt the ascent. It might prove accessible from the southernmost branch of the main valley glaciers, but this route would involve at least two camps, and at the moment I had no intention of making lengthy expeditions. Could it be approached from the Bhayandar Valley? It should be possible to examine it by climbing some distance up the northern side of the valley, and such a reconnaissance had the advantage of indulging botanical work. So, 2 days after our retreatment from Rataban, Nurbu and I crossed the valley and, after mountaining grass slopes, scrambled up a steep, craggy buttress on which our handholds consist for the most parts of juniper roots. We did not pause until we were nearly 2000 feet above the floor of the valley, when we seated ourselves and examined the mountain through my monocular glass. From this direction, it appears as a rock peak rather than a snow peak, built up of striated cliffs dipping sharply from south to north. The snow ridge we had seen consists of nevi resting on the uppermost part of these striations. Between the peak and a minor rock peak to the north, overlooking the Bhayandar Valley, is a wide gully. It should it if this could be entered from a little valley branching off at right angles from the Bhayandar Valley, it seemed as though the ridge could be approached over one or other of the series of sloping snow-covered shelves. The lowermost portion of the gully was concealed behind behind the shoulders of the minor rock peak we had already climbed, but I came to the conclusion that serious difficulty was unlikely. These points settled, Nurbu and I spent 2 or 3 hours scrambling about for flowers. We were climbing a steep ridge when I came across on the first blue Popeye, Meconopsis aculeata. I had seen it in bloom. It was growing solitary in a rocky sentry box, its roots and foliage protected from the sun yet adequately nourished by the slow seep of water. Holsworth described this flower as being the color of the sky at dawn, and so indeed it is. As I pulled up on to a ledge or of the breath after a stiff scramble, it confronted me not more than a yard away, lighting the dark shadowed rocks behind it. Like most poppies, it is open and wide, droops slightly, has a center of many golden stamens, and it is so fragile that its petals are detached merely by brushing against them. It protects itself with sharp spines arranged on the stem and buds, which penetrates the skin like so many minute spears. We were crossing a gully when my companion pointed upwards, and I saw, not more than 400 feet higher, on a snow bed in a gully, a herd of about a dozen burhals. For a few moments they did not see us. Then the leader, a grand old beast with a splendid head, gave a shrill whistle, and away they went, helter skelter over the snow, and in incredible fast rush across the steep wall of the gully. When they penetrated the Nanda Devi basin, Messrs. Shipton and Tillman found herds of comparatively tame burrowls. It is possible that the absence of bears as of humans accounted for this. In the Bhayandar Valley, there are bears, and the burrowls are very wary. This is the only explanation I can give for their timidity in the inner district, which, as far as I know, has never been visited by sportsmen. In Tibet, I have seen almost tame burals, and during the 1933 Mount Everest expedition, they grazed near the base camp. No bears have been observed in Ronbok Valley, and the Tibetans take no wildlife. Tameness and timidity in wildlife is a study of considerable interest. When small beasts are hunted or preyed upon by larger or fiercer beasts, they must of necessity become timid and wary. But in districts where no hunting occurs and there are no ferocious beasts, it is reasonable to suppose that creatures should be less timid. June 26th dawned with an evil sky. Far above the highest peak lay a roof of slate colored cloud, and in the valley livid mist had already congregated. I was doubtful whether it was worthwhile setting off to climb the snow peak, particularly as the drizzle of rain was falling. But the men settled matters by putting down my tent and packing it up. As I had sent Pasang down to Joshimath for my mail, I took with me only Wangdi and Nurbu, which meant that I had to travel with light equipment. Descending into the valley, we walked along the south bank of the stream, and after forcing our way through some dense vegetations, entered the side valley already mentioned. The weather improved visibly as we ascended this, and we were trudging up the terminal moraines of a small glacier which fills most of it. When the mist parted and the snowy summit of our peak stood out full in the sun. As quickly as possible, I climbed the moraine, arriving on top of the last mist were vanishing. Now I could see what I had not seen before, that the base of the gully could be approached without difficulty over a level and uncrevassed glaciers. I had already noted a possible camping site on a ridge between the gully and the another gully to the south of it, which formed a channel for ice avalanches from a conspicuous hanging glaciers far up on the face of the mountain. As the main gully was exposed to falling stone, we mounted for some distance by the side of it, then crossed it quickly where it was comparatively narrow. Although the crossing only took a minute or two, we did not care of it, and now and then stones were skidding down the hard snow. Our camping site was by a large overhanging boulder perched on the crest of the ridge, which formed an excellent kitchen. It had cracked above and appeared insecurely poised, but Wangdi laughed away my faint protests and proceeded to pitch the porter's tent under the overhang. After leveling a platform for my tent immediately above the boulder, the cooking fuel was dwarfed rhododendrons collected on the way up. It was necessary first of all to construct a little trench of stones in which an empty cigarette box and sundry pieces of dried grasses were placed to provide the nucleus for the conflagrations. Pieces of dwarf rhododendron was then arranged on top, after which Wang Di and Nurbu lay flat on their stomach on either side of the trench and, taking in it in turns, blew energetically at the smouldering wood. It was an exhausting process, and soon their eyes were streaming with acrid smoke, which issued in suffocating clouds from the kitchen. But they were undaunted, and an hour later, with a grin of triumph, Wang Din brought me a cup of tea. It was well nigh undrinkable, but so much hard work had gone on making of it that I could not, in decency, refuse it or even surreptitiously throw it away. So, summoning up all the fortitude of it which I was capable, I gulped down what was virtually liquid rhododendron smoke. 100 feet above the camp was a steep crag forming a projecting buttress, which could which would deflect down the gully to south of us any ice avalanches passing from the hanging glaciers. I was already seen I had already seen Primula nivalis on the way up, so to work off the baleful effects of the tea, which promised to be both peculiar and distressing, I climbed up ostensibly to look for flowers. I had not gone far when I saw, spreading from the thin crack above me, a little clump of densely clustered light blue flowers, still shining with the morning rain. I had I had an awkward climb, as the rock were nearly vertical at this point. But when at length I succeeded in reaching the plant, I recognized it as a Paraquilegia grandiflora, which I had seen once before during the 1936 Mount Everest expeditions. It would be difficult to find a more genuine rock plant than this, or more delightful contrast to the stern crags. One blast of cold wind would suffice to wither and shrivel it, a single frost to burn its tender foliage, yet it grows, a miracle of growth. Battered by storm, scorched by sun, the prey of hail, storm, and blizzard, heaven knows how it grows, and that, I think, is the correct answer. The weather, having cleared up to a point, remained undecided until sunset, when there was a further turn for the better, and in the west Neelkant appeared, cutting sharply through long thin lines of mist. Ours was an impressive situation. On the one hand was the wide gully by which we must commence the ascent on the morrow, with an icy channel down the middle cut by falling stones. On the other hand, the icy swept gully ending beneath a precipice crowned by a great mass of shattered ice fully 300 feet thick. No ice fell, but there were numerous falls, among them block weighing at least a ton, which tore down the gully, hit a projecting crack, and flew far out into the air, disappearing from sight with a deep droning hum. Just before dark, our boulders gave two or three such ominous creaks that Wangdi and Nurbu thought better of camping immediately beneath it, and hastily excavated a platform to one side. For supper, I had the cold remains of Montmorency, a couple of potatoes, biscuits, jam, and cup of Ovaltine. The last named beverage, which in happier circumstances makes an excellent nightcap, had been ruined by the all-pervading smoke of dwarf rhododendron. I threw it away when the men were not looking, but did not fail to compliment Wang Di. Poor man, it had cost him and Nurbu fully an hour energetic blowing to produce it. The night was calm and warm, too warm for the height, which cannot have been less than 14,500 feet. We breakfasted at late hour of 5:30 instead of 4:30 as planned, everyone having overslept. The tea was undrinkable and the porridge barely eatable. However, this had the effect of hastening us on our way, and we were off at 6 o'clock. The snow, although only slightly frozen, was hard, and step cutting or kicking was necessary all the way. To avoid falling stones, we kept to the edge of the gully, and there was only one place where we had to turn, a projecting corner of rock that was in the least dangerous. It was a calm morning, and there were certain amount of cloud about, while the southern sky was heavy with dense masses of cumulus, backed by tall anvils of false cirrus. In all probabilities, the monsoons was already drenching the plains and foothills. Having passed a precipitous belt of rocks above the camp, we abandoned the gully in favor of a snow shelf, which slanted steep towards the upper Nivai. In gaining this shelf, we came upon a glorious display of Primula nivalis, growing in thousands on ledge, watered by the melting snows. There can be little or no earth in such situation, and there is no doubt that this is the hardiest of our primulas, rejoicing as it does in barren rocks, stunning water, and coarse grit. Without pause, we climbed up and along the shelf. Presently, passing above the hanging glaciers, I was now reaching my best mountaineering form, and it was no longer a fatigue but a joy to climb. This stage is reached when muscles are entirely under control, and rhythm, without which it is impossible to enjoy mountaineering, has been acquired. Wang Di was also fit, else he could not have sung without pause a monotonous little dirty, which lasted him only 2 or 3 steps before it had to be repeated. Presently, the slope steepened into an ice bulge, to avoid which we mounted close to the rock wall, bounding the uppermost edge of the shelf. Above the bulge, we saw that in order to gain the slopes leading to the upper Nivai, we must either work through the ice falls up slopes, which would almost certainly become dangerous later in the day. We climbed a rock wall immediately above us to crest of a ridge. I decided upon the last course, as the wall was breached at one place by a gully of no particular difficulty. At its base, the gully was defended by a bush-crowned marginal crevice, but this was well bridged with avalanche debris, and we crossed without difficulty to the snow slope above. The snow was in good order, and we mounted quickly to where the gully ended under some rocks. These proved loose but not difficult. The and within a few minutes we had climbed them and were seated in the sun on the ridge. We had been going hard, and it was the time for a rest and a meal from our position. We took along an easy, almost horizontal ridge ending in the glacier clad face of the mountain, which we must scale before gaining the upper snow crest. It was a straightforward climb, except at the point where the ridge abutted against the face. Here, a wall of ice about 50 feet high would have to be surmounted in order to gain the easy looking slopes running to the summit ridge. 20 minutes later, we set off again and scrambled along the broken rocks of the ridge, where I had to tell Wang Di, who was at the end of the rope, that he must not attempt fancy routes of his own. He was an independent fellow and always imagined that he knew best. Occasionally he did, but generally he did not, and he would waste valuable time in climbing up a bit of rock by a different route simply because it was different route. The ice wall was not as formidable as it looked, but it presented a pretty problem in step cutting up a broken corner. I enjoy ice work, and solving this alone made the climb worthwhile. Furthermore, it was a sensational place, as the corner overhung a sheer drop of 2 or 300 feet, where the glacier broke, away to the left. To a lover of icecraft, there is something peculiarly satisfying in the hard, clean thump of the ice axe. Pick meeting ice and step cutting brings the same sort of satisfaction that a sculptor experiences when working with his chisel. Cutting steps is not a matter of brute force but an art to be performed with the minimum expenditure of effort and the maximum of enjoyment. A good ice axe is not merely a shaft of wood with a steel head at the end of it, but something that lives, and it is for this time being an essential part of the mountaineer. The feel of it, the balance of it contribute in some subtle way to the enjoyment of it. To get the best of out of it, you must treat it gently, deliberately, and rhythmically, not blindly and forcefully. To the layman, this may seem unnecessarily lyrical and even ridiculous. What is there, he asks, in cutting the step in ice? If you could answer this, watch one of the Oberland guides at work. Easy, you say, then try it yourself. There is Sonja Henley's skating, easy but. Presently, we were on the slope above, and first we had to steer a devious course between crevices, but once these were passed, the slope stretched unbroken before us to the summit ridge. The climbing now was the antithesis of work on the ice fall, dull slogging work of no interest whatsoever. Light mist had formed, and the sun shone through them with the hot, suffocating power that sapped our energy. I was not altogether happy about the snow, for that fallen during the recent bad weather had not consolidated perfectly as yet, and the general formation of the slope makes it an avalanche trap. So at the interval, I kicked and prodded at it with my axe in order to determine its consistency. The surface layer of new snow was about 8 inch thick. Beneath this was breakable crust, and beneath that granular snow. It was in the surface layer of that danger lay, in any, if any. At present, it was adhering firmly to the old crust beneath, but later, when the sun grew hotter, it might slide. It was essential, therefore, to reach the summit and return as quickly as possible. Our pace was very slow on the last part of the slope, for the sum, for the sun was nigh intolerable, and the snow very soft. It was with considerable relief that we reached the ridge leading towards the summit. The summit was not far distant, so or so thought, and was separated from us by a sharp snow edge. After the slogging work of the snow slope, this edge was delightful to tread. With renewed energy, we pressed on, and some 20 minutes later trod to the point we had seen. It was not the summit, beyond stretched the ridge, as first almost horizontally, then steeply, disappearing into the mist. I heard a groan of disappointment from Nurbu. I could echo his protest, as we had climbed fully 4,000 feet in 3.5 hours, and I was now very tired. It was a pity to be so tired, otherwise, we might better have enjoyed this splendid ridge. When I had first seen it from our camp under the Bhayandar Pass, it had looked magnificent, and it was magnificent. The blue ideal of snow ridges, not too soft and not too hard, with an edge molded by wind and storm into a perfect blade. We had not advanced far when a strong cold wind forced us to halt to put on our spare clothing and balaclava helmets. This wind had only one thing to be said in its favor: it would prevent the lower snow slopes from becoming dangerous. For the rest, it was bitterly cold, and though it had little effect on the grim visaged Bangdi, it was fast knocking the stuffing out of Nurbu. The ridge seemed interminable, for mist always adds to the apparent length of the ridge. I had assumed that it stretched unbroken to the summit, but such was not the case. There was a break in it, a curious rift where the lowermost part of had separated from the uppermost and sunk, leaving an almost vertical wall about 20 feet high. No doubt the mist and our fatigue magnified this wall out of proportion to its true size. As all events, the sight of it was too much for Nurbu. ठीक ने साहिब ठीक ने not good sir not good he ejaculated, but strangely enough this unexpected difficulty had the opposite effect on Wang Di and myself. It stimulated our flagging energy. I shouted at Nurbu through the rush of the wind, a villainous mixture of English and Urdu. We were not going to lose the peak now. At the same moment, I saw through the ice rimmed oval of Wendy's balaclava a sudden grin. The next moment, like the mountain he is, he had driven in his axe and given the rope a turn around it, prepared for my advance. The wall was composed of hard nevi, not pure ice, and a few slashes with the adze end of the ice axe were sufficient for the step. In a few minutes we were up. The summit could not be far off. Of a sudden, the mist swirled asunder. Ahead of us, the snow ridges swept up in a perfect curve to end in a perfect point, sunlit and infinitely beautiful, against a pool of blue sky. 10 minutes later, at 10:50, we were there. Strangely enough, the air was calm, although the wind was tearing across the crest a few feet below. Not as unusual phenomena on mountain. My principal memory is of my feet, which were very cold. On the lower slope, my boots had leaked in the wet snow, and the wind on the summit ridge had completed my discomfiture. Thus, much of my time on the summit was spent in waggling my toes about in my wet, half frozen socks in an attempt to restore circulation. Apart from this, I mustered up sufficient energy to take a photograph, or rather to set the delay action release in the shutter so that all three of us could be included. As a memento of the occasion, this, when printed, showed Wang Di posed in the manner of some Grecian athlete about to do his stuff, looking his very toughest and grimmer, with a long bamboo cigarette holder projecting defiantly from his lips. Nurbu also had so far forgotten his tiredness as to smoke a cigarette, while I am chiefly remarkable for my headgear, which consisted of a balaclava helmet to protect my ears and face from the cold wind, and on the top of that double tarai felt hat put on during our stay on the summit to protect my head from the sun. Such are the peculiar conditions at high altitude. The peaks we had climbed must be about 19,500 feet, as our camp was between 14,500 and 15,000 feet. We had climbed between 4,500 and 5,000 feet. The climb had taken, including halts, 4 hours and 50 minutes, which must be accounted fast going at this height. With the possibility ever present in my mind of the lower snow slopes becoming dangerous, I gave the order to descend after a stay of 10 minutes. Even at great altitudes in Himalayas, it is possible to descend at an alpine speed. Within half an hour, we were off the snow ridge. The slopes below had not changed appreciably and were still safe. We raced down them to the ice wall. Here an unpleasant incident occurred. Wang Di was first down, then came Nurbu, and lastly myself. I was reasonably well placed to check a slip, but when Nurbu decided to jump down the last 6 or 8 feet without saying anything to me as to his intention, he nearly pulled me after him. I should be very surprised if he ever did such a thing again, for what I had to say about it at the time must have impressed itself indelibly on his memory. We regained the camp at 1 o'clock after descending in 2 hours, and after drinking some dwarf rhododendron tea, set off an hour later to the base camp. As we passed along the riverbed, we came on bird's nest in a hollow between two stones containing four eggs of a greyish blue color. It was a foolish place for a nest, as it was only an inch or two above the stream level and would certainly be inundated when the monsoon broke. And there was even every sign that the monsoon was about to break, for the sky was dark with impending storm, and heavy drops of warm rain began to fall shortly before we reached the base camp. At 6 p.m. it rained heavily, and soon after nightfall there was a fall little short of a cloudburst. As I lay in my sleeping bag writing up my diary by the light of the candle, lightning began to flicker, and above the bombardment of the rain on the tent, I heard the thunder growling on the peaks. The sound of the torrent rose to a roar, and I thought of the bird's nest. By now it must have been destroyed. Finally, I slept, drummed into oblivion by torrential rain.